Okay, hi Tara, it's Farah. Can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear you yet, but I can see you responding. Yes. Hi, Tara.
Hi.
Oh, great. There, we can hear you now.
Oh, good. Okay.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
So, what we need from Dr. Harris is we'd love to connect with her at 12:30.
Okay.
We'd love to have, you can hear me, right, Doctor?
Tara, can you hear him? Okay.
When you connect, if you could immediately mute yourself, and you'll be able to see the stream, you'll be able to hear everything happening live. And basically, as soon as you're introduced, you can unmute and just go. Does that make sense?
How do I connect at 12:30?
Can she just stay connected and not?
Sure.
Yeah.
We can do
You
that.
don't have to disconnect. You can just kind of put yourself on mute and have a snack or something, and then just be kind of like in your chair. Yeah. Let's not disconnect.
Okay. So at 12:30, I can just unmute myself?
No, I'll call your name. So I'm actually going to say, speaking of species survival plans, like I'm going to ask Nancy Hawks about it. So I'll say, speaking of species survival plans, we're going to introduce Dr. Tara Harris. So there'll be like a few second lead in. So during that time, you can take yourself off mute. And that'll be kind of your cue that, that we're coming up on you.
Okay. All right.
And if you could be there just a few minutes early, because the other Tara that's calling in, Tara Stawinski, is calling from Rwanda, and I don't know if she's connected yet or not. And so in the event that she doesn't connect, we're just going to skip that section and keep going. So you'll pop up a little.
Oh, I lost you. Are you there? Hello?
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. So, yeah. So you can go ahead, mute, hang about, but if you can be on, maybe like 12:15, or you can come on at 12 and just listen and watch, so you kind of see how it goes, and then we will. I'll say your name a few seconds before you need to be prepared to say words. I think I've lost your audio again. I don't know if they can hear you, but they may have put you.
I muted it.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
So all I need to do is just hit unmute, and you're doing the rest on your end to bring up my screen.
Yes.
All right. Sounds good. All right, I'm gonna mute now.
Okay. Sorry, Tara. We're gonna go silent now. I'll talk to you in a bit. Do you know if they've figured out a solution yet for me to be able to see the live poll results? I know you were in that conversation. Then they pull it up on the screen. I couldn't see it, so they were going to see if there's another way they could show me.
I will ask them right now.
Perfect. Thanks. Hi. Welcome to Woodland Park Zoo's One Wild World, examining the intersection of animals, humans, and habitats in a global pandemic. This three-part series is possible thanks to financial support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is brought to you live from this studio in Seattle thanks to Seattle Lives and PNTA. I'm Farah Paul, Director of Public Relations and Community Affairs at Woodland Park Zoo, and I'll be your moderator for today's event called One Care, Animals and Human Care and the Role of Zoos. We have a wonderful panel joining us in the studio, and we'll be socially distancing and wearing our masks when we can to keep each other safe. We also have some awesome live and pre-recorded guests that'll be joining us throughout the hour. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all of you a question for a quick live poll. Please open your chat function and type in your response. Here's the question. Do you see your personal health connected to the health of wildlife? I'll read that one more time. Do you see your personal health connected to the health of wildlife? Type 1 for, I've never thought about this, ever. Type 2 for, I can see some connection. Type 3 for, I can see a lot of connection. Or type 4 for, we are critically tied to one another. While you're typing in your answer, I'd like to introduce Rachel Salant, Curator of Behavioral Husbandry and Ambassador Animals at Woodland Park Zoo. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for being here. Who do you have with us?
Hi, Farah. We're so excited to be here today. I want to introduce you to Buddy. Buddy is our 8.5-year-old pharaoh eagle owl. Pharaoh as in the pharaohs of Egypt. They would be native to northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Buddy here was born, or actually hatched. Buddy is an owl. He was hatched at another facility, a falconer actually. A gentleman that uses birds for abatement purposes actually hatched him for us, and he came to join us when he was a young little hatchling. And now Buddy is doing one of his favorite types of programs. He loves coming out and getting to interact with folks in this kind of calm setting where he gets to hang out in the glove and folks can see how cool he is.
Well, Buddy is just beautiful. Thanks for bringing here in the studio. You know, today we're going to be talking about animals in human care and the role of zoos, and especially during this pandemic. So when COVID hit back in March, our zoo had to shut down. And I understand that Buddy and the other ambassador animals had some special attention and care during that time. Can you tell us about it?
They sure did. So normally, under regular circumstances, ambassador animals are really comfortable going out, getting close with our guests and giving them that up-close experience. And of course, while we were closed, our animals didn't get to do that. But we got a little creative with some things that we got to do around zoo grounds. We actually took them out to see some of the other animals to give them that interaction. So Buddy got to go see the penguins, and we took our armadillo to see the otters, and our North American porcupine got to go out on some walks around zoo grounds when normally they may not be doing that. So we actually ended up having a lot of fun.
Love that.
Yeah.
You know, we have an amazing panel today, and a lot of them are your colleagues, and many of them have told me that even as a kid, they knew they wanted to work with animals, and I think that's your story too. There's a lot of kids and students watching today from all over the state. What would you say to those kids that want to grow up and work with animals one day?
I would say follow your dreams. If I can do it, you can do it. Mostly it just means find a way to get involved, whatever that may be. For me, it was starting to volunteer. So a lot of zoos and aquariums do take volunteers at a really young age. I would also encourage you to hold on to that dream, but also be really flexible with what you think you want. You know, you want to work with animals, just be flexible with it. Folks like me, we work really closely with individuals like Buddy, but there are other folks like scientists that study maybe pharaoh eagle owls, a population as a whole. And so there's a lot of ways, or veterinarians that take care of them and their particular, you know, their individual health. So there's a lot of ways you can get involved with animals. I encourage everyone to explore all the options and see what really suits you best.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to Buddy for being here.
Thanks,
I hope
Buddy.
we'll see you next week with another special guest.
Yeah, we won't tell you who though.
Yeah. Well, let's now pull up the results of our live poll. We asked you if you see that your personal health is connected to the health of wildlife. And let's see how you responded. Okay, well, maybe you didn't respond yet, so go ahead and type in those answers. Oh, they're popping up. It looks like 100% of you so far have said that you can see some connection. Well, that's great. Thanks for participating. Thanks for chiming in. And we're going to revisit this question later in the episode. Well, to get this started, I'd like to have a special message from Dan Ashe, the president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
Hello, I'm Dan Ashe, president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the world's foremost accrediting and professional organization for aquariums and zoos. AZA accreditation signifies excellence. Worldwide, tens of thousands of facilities display animals, but only 240 have achieved AZA accreditation. I'm also a lifelong conservationist. Prior to joining AZA, I made a career in the world's largest wildlife conservation organization, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, including serving as the agency's director under President Barack Obama. Modern and accredited zoos and aquariums exist to conserve wildlife and wild places, and their work and their success has never been more important than it is today. Yes, visiting Seattle's fabulous Woodland Park Zoo is fun, but equally informative, engaging, inspiring, and purposeful, because guest revenue supports more than $230 million in field conservation projects every year, including efforts to combat unethical trade and wildlife trafficking that is devastating wildlife, increasing the risk of disease spillovers and pandemics. As people are increasingly urban-centered and spending less time in nature, aquariums and zoos are providing crucial connections with animals for more than 200 million guests annually, creating memories, increasing empathy, inspiring action. Zoos and aquariums have been hit hard by the pandemic. So when you're ready, please visit. It'll make a difference for you, your family and friends, and for nature.
Thanks, Dan. That was a great lead into today's event because we're going to be talking about the role of wildlife conservation and zoos all over the world. Before I introduce our panel, I do want to say we've got some updated poll results, and it looks like more than half of you have said that we are critically tied to one another, and I'm so glad to see that. Well, if you're just joining us, welcome to episode 1 of One Wild World series. Today we're featuring One Care, Animals and Human Care and the Role of Zoos. Let's meet our panel of experts from Woodland Park Zoo. Dr. Nancy Hawks, Director of Animal Care, Dr. Tim Storms, Associate Veterinarian, and Dr. Bonnie Baird, Animal Welfare Scientist. Hi, thanks for being here with me. So Dr. Storms, thanks for being here. I understand that the very first case that you worked on at Woodland Park Zoo was an interesting one.
Absolutely. First thing I ever did here was participate in a procedure with Vip, our gorilla, who is our oldest male gorilla. He's 42 now. And he had a critical situation with a hernia that entrapped part of his intestines and needed life-saving surgery. That was a collaboration with some surgeons from the University of Washington Hernia Center, and a nice example of collaboration that we do with human professionals as well.
Well, I'm so glad that Vip's doing well, and it's a great example because we're going to be talking more about apes in just a minute. Dr. Baird, thanks for being here. You know, until I met you, I didn't know that an animal welfare scientist was a thing.
Yeah, lots of people don't. Actually, I didn't know it was a thing until well into college. I always wanted, just like Rachel said, I always had a deep connection to animals growing up. I remember going to Cleveland Park Zoo all the time when I was growing up and loving every minute of it. My favorite game to play was if I could name all the species without looking at the signs. It was very annoying to my parents, but that's what I did. So when I got to college, I thought, well, you like animals, you're good in school, they tell you to be a veterinarian. Sorry, Dr. Tim, that is not my path in life. I learned in college that was not, I was more interested in the psychology classes and the behavior classes than I was in the organic chemistry and the cell molecular stuff. So I fumbled around for a while, trying out different things. Like Rachel said, I worked at wildlife rehab, I worked as education in nature centers, I tried lots of different things. Then I've got an internship at the National Zoo, Smithsonian's National Zoo in DC, doing an animal behavior internship, and that's when I learned that you can use behavior and data to improve the lives of animals in human care, and I was hooked. So since then, I went to graduate school right in my own backyard in Cleveland, back to my home zoo, Cleveland Park Zoo, and I was able to get my PhD in animal welfare, and now here I am in Seattle.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing at the zoo in just a few minutes. Dr. Hawks.
Hi.
Hi. You know, I'm sure you get this question all the time as a director of animal care. What's your favorite animal?
No. I do, and that's a tough one, you know, because I love them all. My passion is really biodiversity. You know, there are so many amazing species on the planet, and when you think about the way that they each make their living and the way that they're all interconnected, it's just, it's amazing. It's just a really, really interesting thing to think about and learn about. And, you know, here's just a little example. So think about a hummingbird, and that hummingbird's beak is just perfectly curved to fit into the salvia flower, and the hummingbird gets to feed on the nectar that the salvia flower provides, but the salvia flower benefits because that hummingbird is pollinating that plant as it goes from flower to flower. It's a beautiful thing. But when I'm pressed, Farah, I always say two, because I can't just pick one, and that would be elephants and butterflies. And that's because I have had the great privilege in my career to work very closely and for a long time with both those groups of animals, and because elephants and butterflies hold very deep personal meaning for me.
Well, I love that. Thank you. I want to start our questions today with you. As you all know, today's topic is animals and human care. And Dr. Hawks, can you tell us, what does that mean to be an animal in human care?
That's a great question. So when you think about it, just about every animal on the planet is in human care to some degree. Even wolves in Yellowstone or rhinos in Kruger National Park in South Africa are managed by humans to some degree. And it's our great responsibility to do that responsibly. you know, even we'll be talking about gorillas in a bit. Mountain gorillas in Rwanda, they receive veterinary care in the wild. So there is a lot of course, every single species is influenced by human human activities. When we talk about accredited zoos, like Dan was telling us about, sharing about, you know, this is our life's work, is providing the best possible life for the animals in our care. And we take that very seriously because it's a responsibility. We provide a window to the natural world for people. People, especially children, who are not so connected to nature as they used to be. And we can provide that experience at the zoo where they can have that, you know, experience that beauty and that wonder, that magic of biodiversity, and experience awe and joy and hope as we help them make connections with animals. And so that part of what we do, that's really the heart of what we do. And we all play different roles in providing that care for animals in our charge.
Well, thanks for sharing that context. And I love that you kind of touch on this idea of conservation in the wild as being human care. We're going to get into that more in a few minutes. But sticking with the topic of zoos for a minute, can you help set us up for this conversation today and give us a little bit of context for what happened in March?
So, as we all know, Seattle was one of the first US cities impacted by the pandemic, and Woodland Park Zoo was one of the first zoos that had to close our doors to guests, and we did that on March 12th. So during that time, we had to really think about everything we were doing. We had to, you know, there was information coming from all different levels of government and public health authorities, and we had to distill that and figure out how that applies to taking care of the zoo and each other. You know, aside from helping keep the operation, the organization viable, and staying connected with our community through virtual experiences and social media, we in animal care needed to focus on a couple of very, very important things. One was the health and safety of our staff. And so we did a few things. We divided our animal care staff into 2 non-overlapping teams so that we could reduce the risk of exposure. And we researched and developed disinfecting protocols that would work well for us in people areas and animal areas. Of course, the hand washing and the physical distancing. And, you know, with the animals, of course, we wanted to figure out how can we maintain our high levels of animal care through this very uncertain time. And we actually developed 3 different contingency plans based on what if 25% of our staff aren't able to come to work? What if 50%? What if 75%? How were we going to continue to take care of the animals? So I have all those plans in writing, tucked away in case we need them, but thankfully we haven't needed them. We haven't gotten anywhere close to 25% of our staff being out. In fact, our staff has done very well, and we've been able to maintain a very high level of animal care. You know, people ask, how are the animals doing through all this? And Bonnie can talk more about her research, but pretty much the animals have been oblivious to this human drama swirling around them and just gone about their business. In fact, we had a bit of a baby boom this spring and summer. Over 35 species at the zoo have given birth, reproduced, and we take that as a great sign that we're providing them what they need and they're doing what they were meant to do, and so we're really excited about that. But before I wrap this part up, I want to just say that we couldn't have done it without our frontline staff. So the folks that are coming in day after day taking care of the animals, taking care of the grounds, maintaining the facilities. These are our true heroes. These are the people that have allowed us to take such good care of the animals and to be able to reopen again to our guests. So thank you.
Nancy, you know, we do surveys a lot with visitors and guests and members, and one of the things that they always tell us is that the welfare of our animals is top notch, and that's what keeps bringing them back. And it really is thanks to all of the staff that are doing that work every day. Dr. Baird, Nancy mentioned that you do some research, and part of your role is monitoring animals and studying them for welfare. Can you tell us, while the zoo was closed over those several months, did you see any changes in their behavior?
Well, as Nancy said, the vast majority of animals didn't even notice that we were closed. They, we have such great frontline staff, and we had such great contingency plans, like Nancy talked about, that their overall everyday experience didn't really change much. They still had their beautiful complex habitats. They still got their enrichment several times a day, their favorite snacks, their time with their keepers. So most of them were oblivious to all the things that, while all the people were running around trying to deal with new policies and new changes and all these things happening, they were just happy to get their snacks every day. So there were a few animals that did have a few behavioral changes, and those are usually our more social animals. So if you ever come to the zoo, there's some species that are very in tune with our guests and our people, like the penguins, perhaps. You might see them always at the glass. Some of our primate species, the animals down at the family farm are very, very used to interacting with our guests. And so that's still closed now, so they still are looking for those, where are my adoring fans? So we did see some of that, and some of the animals that are a little bit more shy. When it was really quiet in the zoo, we might see more some startle effects. They might start a little bit or just stare when somebody would walk by, but it was very, very temporary, and then they would remember, oh right, you're here. It's fine, I'm not gonna get eaten by a lion, it's okay. Yeah, many of the changes completely disappeared that we did see once we started reopening again. They went right back to where they were before.
Well, that's great, thanks, Bonnie. Dr. Storms, you know, as we've been hearing about some of the changes to our animals, it also begs the question about what were some of the changes to the people who take care of them. And I know on the animal health team, there were some changes that you had to adjust to. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. And just because the zoo closed didn't mean the animal care could stop, and everyone had to continue on trying to provide the best care possible to the animals despite that. What that meant for us was, along with the keepers and other staff, frontline staff in the zoo, was we split into different teams to minimize exposure to ourselves and try to reduce the potential risk of infection from the virus. So we had, for example, a veterinarian paired with a couple technicians on one part of the week, and a different veterinarian paired with another couple technicians on the other part of the week, and we never saw each other. So the big challenge was communicating well, communicating actions, necessary care for the animals, what treatments had to be done, what was the next step in the process for either diagnosis or treatment of a challenging case. That was a challenge, but I'm very proud of everyone for working through that. We really did a great job, I believe, keeping a continuity of care all the way through, and had some real successes even so, despite all of that.
And you've told me about a study that came out that sort of influenced some of the animal care choices that we were making. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the other part of that whole equation was the changes that we had to make as far as how we were interacting with the animals, so as not to inadvertently cause an infection in them. So there were some studies early on, and there have been more that have come out, and there's still a lot not known. But there was an early study that showed that potentially ferrets or cats were susceptible to this disease compared to others. Dogs were not very susceptible, for example. But that influenced a lot of recommendations for how which animals we paid more attention to in terms of protecting. There was also assumptions made that apes, for example, being more similar to us in, in physiology and their response to infections, they're susceptible to a lot of the same infections that we are, that we needed to protect them as well, despite no infections in those groups. So we made changes in how we interacted in front of them. Same thing we do with other people. Social distancing, use of personal protective equipment with face masks and gloves, minimizing the time that we spend closely in front of them, and just being smart about how we cared for them. That extended to food preparation and other things that you might not think of directly, but yeah.
Thanks, Thank you. Well, the study that Dr. Storms is talking about talks about ferrets and species that are like them, including otters. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us to hear from our friends at Seattle Aquarium about what's changed for them. So let's hear from their Director of Life Sciences, Grant Abel.
Hi, my name is Grant Abel and I'm the Director for Life Sciences at Seattle Aquarium. And my role here is to lead and to manage a dedicated team of aquarists and biologists providing care for the animal collection, both the marine fish and invertebrates, as well as our marine mammals and birds. When the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged and we were faced with closing the aquarium back in March, we really had to dig deep to understand what precautions we needed to put in place to protect our team that needed to continue providing care for the animals, as well as any of the animals that might be susceptible. Obviously, the fish were the most least affected by this pandemic. However, there were additional layers of biosecurity that we needed to put in place around the use of underwater diving equipment and our dive team. We found also that the North American river otters and sea otters were a particularly susceptible group to contracting this virus. And so there were additional layers of biosecurity around who would be feeding the animals and who would have access to their back of house areas, that type of thing, in order to protect them from the potential of being, of this virus being transmitted to them. In addition to that, when we began to organize ourselves to reopen again back in June and bring back our volunteer divers and other staff, there was obviously a lot of training that needed to be done to provide our volunteer divers with the information around the additional biosecurity that we've put in place for use of the underwater equipment, as well as just working in the back of house areas with our staff and working together in sometimes tight spaces, but maintaining the social distancing and wearing masks and continuing other hygiene measures that are in place. So we're very glad to be open. We're very pleased at the response of the guests adhering to the various protocols that are in place at front of house. We look forward to continuing this as long as necessary until we can all get back on our feet and resume our full operations again.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks to our friends at the aquarium for being part of this series. As we're talking about changes in protocols, I'd like to come back to Dr. Hawks and ask you, I understand that not everything had to change. And one place where we already had some great protocols in place is with our apes. So can you tell us what species are considered apes and what changed for them, if anything?
Sure. So apes are gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, which are sometimes called pygmy chimpanzees. And then there's the gibbons and siamangs, which are sometimes called lesser apes, but we'll just consider them apes for the context of this conversation. And so these groups of animals are all very similar to humans in terms of genetics, anatomy, and physiology, and we can also share many of the same diseases. And so even the common cold, right? And so in working with these animals, when we're in close proximity, we already use for instance, PPEs, we already use disinfection, washing our hands, and so it wasn't a big change to have to do that with our apes. And as you've heard, though, there were some other species that we found out maybe not going to get COVID, but there's some evidence in the literature that they're more susceptible to the class of coronaviruses, and so we've taken extra precautions with them as well.
Well, and while the zoo was closed, we had a special new addition that changed the troop dynamic of our gorillas, and I had originally intended to just ask you about that, but it sounds like you actually have some extra fun news to share.
We do. So first, Kitoko is our youngest gorilla. He's about 6 months old, and he is in that really fun toddler stage. He's just playing and exploring and enjoying being with his family. He is the son of Azama, our 12-year-old female, and Kwame, our 19-year-old silverback. But the big exciting news, or the new exciting news, is that Kitoko is going to have a sibling or a half-sibling in February. And Nadiri, one of our other females who's 24 years old, is pregnant and going to be giving birth in February. And Kwame is also the father of this little one. So we're very excited.
That's exciting. Thank you. So Kitoko is going to be a big brother, and all of you just heard about it first. So that's great. Thanks, Nancy. You know, Dr. Storms, you had told us earlier about the fact that there was this split schedule on the veterinary team, but I understand that there was an exception that had to be made, and that was related to baby Kitoko. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, that was a scary day. Kitoko got severely injured in an altercation between a couple of the gorillas and ended up with a wound to his head and had a skull fracture. And so we all had to leap into action. Never mind the split schedules, all of the veterinarians, all the technicians, everyone on hand, all of the gorilla staff were participating too. And at a moment's notice, surgeons from the Seattle Children's Neurosurgery Unit responded and participated and helped to stabilize him. And we did surgery to deal with his fracture and treat the wound and stabilize him. And amazingly, within 24 hours, he was back with his family, back with his mom. It took a long time to get him back with the larger group because of obvious precautions and worries about head trauma and his vulnerability with his wound. But it was such a tremendous effort on everyone's part, and just really proud of everyone working together, keepers, veterinarians, technicians, the human surgeons that responded so quickly, and it was a great success.
And he's doing well now?
He's doing great. He was 2.5 months old at that time, and as Nancy said, he's now about 6 months old. So that was a scary time, but he's never looked back.
That's great. And he had such a huge outpouring of support and love on our social media channels from our friends and our followers, and I'm sure that they're all so glad that he's doing well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of little ones, Dr. Baird, can you tell us who's Yola and how's she doing?
Yola is our 4-year-old gorilla in that same group with Kwame and in Kitoko and the family there. If you've been to the zoo, she is a fan favorite. She is a guest favorite and a staff favorite. You can often find her over at the window interacting with people or just watching the people. She likes to play with kids because until recently, she was the only kid in the group, so she was looking for other kids to play with. So while we were closed, I'm sure she was wondering where her adoring fans were. But a lot of the keepers around the zoo took extra time to come over to the glass or to the window safely and interact with her, spend extra time playing with her one-on-one. She's also been extremely interested in Kitoko and just waiting for him to get big enough to be a full-time playmate. So she's been spending most of the summer testing her boundaries with Azama. How close can she get? Can she touch him yet? Until mom shoos her away. But I'm sure she's very excited to be the oldest of the group of kids they're about to have.
Thank you. Well, I know that we've been talking about animals in human care, and as Dr. Hawks mentioned earlier, human care can sometimes mean conservation that's happening in other places and in the wild. And our next guest, Bonnie, I understand it's someone that you have a close relationship with. Would you like to introduce her?
Absolutely. So I am so excited to introduce a personal hero of mine and a mentor and a friend, the president and CEO of the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund International, Dr. Tara Stawinski.
Hi, Dr. Stawinski. Can you hear me?
I can. Can
Great.
You guys hear me?
We can. Thank you so much for joining us. Where are you calling from?
I am actually calling from Rwanda. You need to let me know if my connection is okay, because I've had a little trouble connecting with you guys.
We can hear you great. Thank you. So you're calling from Rwanda. Thanks for joining us here in Seattle from the other side of the world. I understand that...
My pleasure. It's nice to see everyone. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Tara.
Nice to
see you.
So your first experience in the field with gorillas was an interesting one. Is that right?
It was, yeah. So I have been studying gorillas for probably about 8 years in zoos when I first got the opportunity to come to Rwanda and work with gorillas in the wild. And I always studied male gorilla dynamics. And so I was going to this group called Shinda's group, and I was so excited because there were 8 males in the group. And when I walked into the group, I mean, gorillas are incredibly intelligent. They recognize people, and the dominant male recognized that I was new. He didn't know who I was. And he also, all the gorillas have their own personalities, and I would say that his is probably, not the best personality. So he decided he needed to put me in my place. So he charged me, and luckily I had read Diane Fossey's book, so I knew not to run. and I crouched down on the ground and I got small. I had my hair up in a ponytail, and so I could literally feel kind of the hairs on the back of my neck going up and down as he was sniffing sniffing me. And the team said, "Tara, don't worry, you're fine, he's just smelling you." But in my mind, poised over kind of the back of my neck were these incredible 2-inch canine teeth that male gorillas have. But luckily, he just wanted to show me who was dominant, and he moved on, and it all went fine from there.
Okay, well, I'm glad that turned out well. You know, when you and I had a chance to talk earlier, you told me that gorillas are critically endangered, and they're also critically important. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so the mountain gorillas that we work with, there are 1,000 of them left on the planet. There are none in zoos, so the only place that they are left is in the wild. The same thing with Growers gorillas, which is another type that we work with. There's about 3,500 of them left on the planet. Again, none in zoos. And what's amazing about gorillas is that they actually live in the second largest standing rainforest left on our planet. So these are literally the lungs of our planet. They take in carbon dioxide, they let out oxygen, and they are one of our best natural defenses against climate change. And you can think of the gorillas as kind of being the gardeners of these forests. So they help keep these forests healthy. So when we protect gorillas, ultimately we're protecting these forests and we're protecting ourselves.
Well, and I think it really makes sense the way that you're connecting gorillas to climate change and painting that big picture. And part of that big picture is recognizing that saving gorillas is more than about saving just one species. In fact, your motto and your organization really puts people at the center. And I'm hoping you can talk to us about the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund and your motto.
Yes, we are incredibly proud to be the world's longest running and largest organization fully dedicated to gorilla conservation. So we've been working in the field for over 50 years. We actually just had our 53rd anniversary of working in Rwanda. But we recognize that for gorillas to thrive, ultimately the people that live near them have to thrive as well. So our motto is actually helping people, saving gorillas. So in addition to the direct protection, you can see our teams here heading out into the field. The direct protection that we do to protect for individual gorillas and their families, we also have a whole host of activities that we do with the local human population, whether it be helping them with their food security or their livelihoods or being in schools and doing conservation education. Because ultimately, as I said, for gorillas to thrive, people need to thrive as well.
Thanks, Tara. And the importance of local communities is something we'll hear more about today and over the course of this series. Specific to your work, how has the pandemic impacted the local communities and their conservation efforts? Have you seen any changes in wildlife trafficking or poaching or anything like that that's creating an extra challenge?
Definitely. I mean, sadly, I think the human communities, a lot of them that live near gorillas, have been substantially affected by COVID. In Rwanda, for example, where we work, tourism is an important source of the economic engine of the country. And when COVID hit, tourism shut down. And so that meant that local communities started to suffer as a result. And then that makes them put more pressure on the gorillas' very limited forest home. And as was referenced earlier, another challenge is that gorillas actually have a genetically identical receptor system to COVID that we do. So then the worry is always, if people are going into the forest to maybe get water or find food, could they also be introducing COVID into that environment? So we've had to modify our work a lot to make sure that we can be in the forest protecting the gorillas every day, doing more to help local communities, and also not risking transferring the disease to the animals. So making sure we're keeping a good distance, wearing masks, all the things we heard Nancy talk about earlier, that the same thing that zoos do to prevent disease transmission when they're working with gorillas in zoos.
Well, they're such amazing creatures, and we're so grateful that you're doing that amazing work out there in Rwanda. My last question for you, we've been talking today about animals and human care. What does that mean to you and the work that your team is doing in the field?
I think there's a lot of ways that zoos and zoo science can inform what's happening in the wild, and it varies a lot depending on species. For gorillas, I think one of the largest roles that zoos can play is having the zoos that are in gorillas, the gorillas that are in zoos, be ambassadors for their wild counterparts. Most people are not going to get to travel to Rwanda to see gorillas, but when they come to a zoo and they see a gorilla in a zoo and they make that connection and they realize how like us they are, how their family structure is like ours, how they take care of, their most vulnerable like we do, it really helps make a connection and hopefully helps them realize why we need to be conserving gorillas in the wild and why a conservation, effort halfway around the world should be important to them as well.
Well, it's important to all of us in the studio. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Stawinski. For those of you who want to learn more about the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, we're going to post a link to their website in our live chat. And Dr. Stawinski also wrote an article recently for CNN, and so we're going to be posting her op-ed in the chat as well. Tara, thank you again for being here with us. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me, and hi from Rwanda.
Tara. Hi, Tara.
Well,
Take care, everybody.
We all just heard from Dr. Stawinski about the importance of communities engaging in conservation. And with that in mind, I'd like to share a message from some conservation partners working with a different type of ape that Dr. Baird and Dr. Hawks mentioned a minute ago, and that's orangutans. Here's Dr. Marc Ancrenaz, Scientific Director at Hutan, to share what's happening in the field in Borneo.
Hi, welcome to Borneo. I am Marc Ancrenaz. I am the Scientific Director of Hutan. We have been working in Sabah for the past 22 years. We really try hard to find ways for people and wildlife to coexist inside and outside of protected forests. Malaysia, of course, has been hit by the COVID outbreak recently. The government of Malaysia decided for a lockdown that lasted nearly 3 months, which means that for 3 months we had to stop our field activities. Everything was on standby except for the patrolling of the area for the protection activities. Luckily in Kinabatangan, people are not heavy hunters, meaning that during and after the COVID outbreak, we haven't seen so much poaching or illegal activities taking place. However, a lot of families who relied on tourism to sustain their livelihood have lost their source of income. Hutan is a major employer of the communities in Lower Kinabatangan. This put even more constraint and more pressure on us to sustain these people, these families who have lost their source of income. Your support is more than ever very, very, very important for us to be able to show the communities that conservation is there to answer their needs in terms of hardship. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dr. Ancrenaz, and thank you for the amazing work you're doing in Borneo. We've shared a link in the live chat to Hutan's website if you'd like to learn more or help support them and their orangutan and wildlife conservation work. I hope you're all enjoying today's discussion. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about a different species that's been very high profile in the past few months, and that's tigers. Dr. Storms, can you tell us what happened in the past few months that put tigers kind of front and center in the COVID spotlight?
Yes, back in March at the Bronx Zoo in New York, there was a tiger that started coughing and had some wheezing, some discharge from the nose, and they did a procedure, an exam, and at that time there's very new testing available for COVID for animals, but they were able to develop a PCR test which tests directly for the genetic material of the virus, and they found it in that tiger. And then there were 3 other tigers and 3 lions in the same building, but not necessarily in the same space, that subsequently became positive for the virus as well. The other cats developed very mild symptoms, cough, that lasted just a short period of time, and some of them had no symptoms. But they were able to screen them for a test using poop, rather than having to do a procedure with them and anesthetize them. So they ended up with 7 animals that had positive for the COVID virus. They all resolved. They all resolved without specific treatment for the virus and have subsequently become negative on repeated testing. So,
thanks for sharing that. And I'm just anticipating this question from folks. Have we had any animals at Woodland Park Zoo demonstrate any symptoms or be diagnosed with COVID?
No, in fact, that episode at the Bronx Zoo was the only episode in the world in a zoo of any zoo animal. So there have been domestic animals that have tested positive, but no zoo animals other than that.
Okay, good to know. So Dr. Hawks, you've already shared some good news with us, but as we're talking about the tiger at the Bronx Zoo, I understand we have some more exciting news that you're going to share.
Yeah, so speaking of tigers, we have the pleasure of hosting a new addition to the zoo. Her name is Azul, and she is a 4-year-old Malayan tiger. who came to us from the Bronx Zoo, from the group that Dr. Storms was just talking about. So she actually just arrived on Saturday, September 26th, I think, and she's doing great. She is temporarily housed down in our quarantine facility at our animal hospital. But she's here on a mission, and she is here to eventually breed with Boomy, who's a 10-year-old male who lives here at the zoo. So we're excited that sometime next year we'll have a pregnant tiger.
That's so exciting. And I've seen some pictures of her. I think we're showing some pictures of her. She's beautiful.
She is beautiful.
Well, and that's our second big announcement that all of you have heard first today. So we have a pregnant gorilla and a new tiger. Dr. Baird, from an animal welfare perspective, can you talk to us about how we make that transition comfortable for an animal like Azul who's moving from one place to another?
Yeah, so zoos and aquariums move animals between facilities all the time to maintain sustainable populations for various reasons. Moving a big animal like a tiger from Bronx, New York to Seattle, Washington is no small feat. So we do a lot of preparation on both sides to help make sure that that's not a very scary and uncomfortable and unpleasant situation for her. So in Azul's case, we sent one of our keepers, our feline keepers, out to the Bronx a few days before her shipment. And he stayed with her in there and learned from her keepers about all her personality traits and her regular routine in her regular home zoo. Then she was loaded up into her crate voluntarily. She has been trained to enter her transport crate voluntarily, so it's not a big deal. We work a lot with our animals knowing that they're going to be transferred at some point in their life to think, oh, well, just go in my crate. It's not a big, it's perfectly normal. So she got up on the plane, accompanied by both our keeper from Woodland Park and also one of her keepers from the Bronx, flew here to Seattle, and upon arrival is now at our quarantine in our hospital. But while she's in quarantine, her keeper from Bronx will stay here in Seattle for a few days to get to know our facility and kind of the transition, teach our keepers about all her personality quirks and all the things that we should know about Azul so that she's comfortable and she has a familiar face when she's first getting comfortable here in Seattle. We'll keep her crate in her enclosure with her at the hospital, so when she's ready to go up to the feline building, then she's all ready to go. She has this nice safe place that she can go if she feels uncomfortable ever. And then we'll kind of let her tell us when she's ready to kind of introduce to the exhibit and more spaces, so we really read their behavior and see when they're ready to go out and be in view of the guest. So stay tuned.
That's great, thank you. Dr. Hawks, you started talking about this a little bit earlier, and I'm hoping you can explain for us, what is a species survival plan?
Species Survival Plan, or SSP, is a collaborative, cooperative network, a program under the direction of AZA that Dan told us about. AZA is our accrediting organization. And the SSP is made up of people like us. So, for example, Tara, who we just heard from, is very recently the head of the APE organization. It's called a TAG, but similar to an SSP. Bonnie's on the Animal Welfare Committee. I'm a research advisor on the Gorilla SSP. So we all sort of take part in this on top of our day jobs to help manage these species. So for instance, there's an SSP for Malayan tigers, like we've been talking about. And I think there's something like 57 Malayan tigers in something like 27 zoos in AZA. Those tigers are managed as one genetic population, and we all have to work together to provide the best day-to-day care, to ensure sustainability of the population, and to support conservation of these animals in nature, as well as do research on their husbandry needs and their reproductive needs and their welfare needs. And very importantly, this group, who's made up of this panel of experts, also maintains what's called a stud book, and it is just what it sounds like. It's a documentation of the lineage of each individual in the SSP that helps us, with the help of sophisticated computer software, to maintain the greatest genetic diversity we can in these populations to keep them healthy. And we do this for the long haul, right? Many of our plans actually plan out the genetic diversity of these populations to 100 years from now. And so I know, I believe that the Malayan tiger SSP has a goal of 150 animals, and so they're only at 47 now, something like that. We'll hear more about that in a minute, but so this one breeding, this recommendation of Azul and Boomy to breed here at Woodland Park Zoo is part of that process, part of that plan to help boost that population of Malayan tigers.
Thank you, Nancy. And as we're speaking about species survival plans, our next guest is Dr. Tara Harris. She's the Director of Conservation and Science at Phoenix Zoo. She's also the coordinator of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Species Survival Plan that you just heard about, and the Tiger Conservation Campaign. Dr. Harris, thanks for joining us. We've been talking about tigers, and I understand that while you care about all tigers, there's one in particular that really speaks to you.
Yes, so the tiger that speaks the most to me just happens to be right here at the Phoenix Zoo. His name is Jay, and I happen to think he's the most handsome tiger I have ever seen. I know I'm biased, but I think if you see the photo, you'll agree that he is quite stunning. And, you know, when I see pictures like this, you know, I just think it's so awe-inspiring and magnificent. You just have to understand why everyone around the world cares about tigers and wants to save them.
Oh, that's a gorgeous tiger. As the coordinator for the Tiger Species Survival Plan, or SSP, you help plan for sustainable populations. Can you tell us what that means?
Sure. So as was said earlier, the Tiger Species Survival Plan is the breeding program for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums for highly endangered populations of tigers. And so specifically, we manage populations of Amur, Sumatran, and Malayan tigers as a sort of genetic insurance policy for their wild counterparts. Now, we hope it never comes to this, but it's possible that these populations could be called upon in the future to help recover wild populations. And so it's important that we try to retain as much genetic diversity as possible, since that's kind of the raw material that can help animals adapt to changing environments. And we all know that our world is changing a lot. And we also want to make sure that we have genetically healthy populations in zoos for generations to come. And so every year we take a look at which animals are related to one another. We look at things like inbreeding, and we make recommendations on which tigers should move from one zoo to another and breed with one another in order to help maintain genetically viable populations into the future. And congratulations on your breeding recommendation.
Thank you. And I think it's a really interesting topic because it might be a role that zoos fill that most people haven't thought about. As a conservation biologist, why do you think that tigers in zoos are really important to tigers in the wild?
So we already touched on one of those, that, you know, it's always possible that our populations could be called upon to help recover wild populations, but also zoos reach an incredible number of people every year that walk through our doors. And we have this incredible opportunity, therefore, to get people excited about tigers, get them to care, inspire them to act on behalf of tigers. And that's a really important role that we play. And so we want everybody to know that their actions, even though it may seem like tigers live very far away, our actions every day can impact tigers in the wild. And so zoos play an important education role for that. And then also zoos raise a lot of money for wild tiger conservation efforts. The Tiger Conservation Campaign that I coordinate has raised $1.4 million directly for efforts in the wild to help save tigers. And I'm really proud to say that one of those projects is Woodland Park Zoo's effort with Panthera and Rimba in the country of Malaysia to help save wild Malayan tigers.
Thank you. And we're actually going to hear from one of our partners in Malaysia in just a minute. You know, as we're thinking about your role as an SSP and working with tigers, I understand that's actually just one aspect of your job. And at Phoenix Zoo, you do a lot of work around native species conservation. What does that look like?
Sure. Well, here at the Phoenix Zoo's Johnson Conservation Center, my team and I work with 10 different species that are native to the state of Arizona. And we think it's really important to take care of the species right here at home, in addition to those that live around the world. And we have, really important and valuable expertise that we can lend to that effort. And so we work with a wide diversity of species, everything from tiny aquatic spring snails to black-footed ferrets. And most of these species are endangered or threatened in the wild. And a lot of the work that we do involves breeding and raising animals for release back to the wild in partnership with other conservation agencies. But we can also do things like research to try and better understand poorly known species as well.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, and I feel like it's a lot. As we're talking about orangutans and gorillas and tigers and native species, it can feel maybe overwhelming for people. And so I'd like to ask you, what advice do you have for folks who really care about animals and they need some ideas about how they can focus their energy?
Sure, well, so first of all, just don't get overwhelmed. Just give yourself credit for all the little things that you do that make a difference for future generations of wildlife. And so take baby steps and think about what you can do in your daily life, whether it's reducing the amount of waste that you produce, whether it's saving energy and conserving water. Those are all really important steps that help both your local wildlife and animals all around the world. But then if you have more time, think about what you love to do in your life and how you might be able to use that to help wildlife. So maybe you love taking amazing photographs like the ones we've been showing. Think about how you can do that and share it and inspire people to care or donate. Or maybe you like to run and maybe you can organize a race for wildlife, things like that. Or maybe you can volunteer for a conservation organization. And then lastly, a lot of conservation organizations just really need your support. And so if you have the means to donate, that is really critical right now. And it's not just for adults. I've seen amazing ideas from kids to raise money for their favorite animals and helping save them in the wild.
That's great advice. Thank you, Tara, and thank you so much for being with us today. For
you
our
for
audience, if you'd like to learn more about the Tiger Conservation Campaign that Dr. Harris mentioned, we've added a link in our live chat. Thanks again, Tara.
Thank you.
And now, as Dr. Harris mentioned, we have a special message from one of our tiger conservation partners in Malaysia. This is Wai Lam, Chief Operations Officer for Rimba, sharing with us some of the challenges they're facing right now in the field.
Hi, my name is Wai, and I am Rimba's Chief Operations Officer for Project Harimau Selamanya, which means Tigers Forever in Malay. I lead a team of 15 Malaysians to monitor and protect one of the last remaining populations of the Malayan tiger in Kenyir, Taman Negara, Terengganu. Much of our work focuses on ensuring there are enough boots on the ground and regular presence in the forest in order to assist the wildlife department in keeping tigers safe from poachers. Now, wildlife poaching through using wire snares is the most critical threat to the Malayan tiger in this region, much of which is being conducted by foreign poachers coming in from Vietnam and Thailand. When the pandemic hit and Malaysia went into lockdown in March this year, the most immediate impact that we felt on our work was when we were unable to go out on patrol for 2.5 months. And even now that we have resumed operations, with the new SOPs, we have to factor in more time for every time a patroller catches a cold or gets a fever. We need more time to ensure that he gets tested and he's quarantined, much of which just translates to decreased manpower on the ground. Another direct impact that we are facing is how the global economic downturn spurred by the pandemic is just decreasing the availability of funding for conservation projects like ours. Now, although the lockdown and the closing of borders might have slowed down the poaching operations, we think that this is just very short-lived because we're not seeing any signs of slowing down on the demand side. Despite the pandemic being a huge obvious wake-up call that zoonotic diseases could have been prevented and could be prevented if wildlife and wild habitats were to be left undisturbed. But we're seeing terrifying reports that the pandemic could be fueling the illegal wildlife trade, because we're seeing reports of peddlers in the wildlife trade in China and other Southeast Asian countries who are touting tiger parts and other wildlife parts as bogus traditional treatments to COVID-19. So I think it is still too early to see the full impact that the pandemic is having on tiger conservation, but we really should brace ourselves for the worst, because if we don't, the critically endangered animals such as the Malayan tiger will not stand a chance.
Thanks, Wai. That's a really important message and a really sobering message. We've shared a link to RIMBA's website in the live chat if you'd like to learn more or help support them in their tiger conservation work. Well, we've spent some time today exploring the topic of animals and human care, and we'd like to take a few minutes now. I hope you hang in there with us. I know it's close to 1 o'clock, but we have a really fantastic guest who's going to help us explore the relationship between humans and animals and why that's so important when it comes to global health. So here to help us with that discussion is Dr. Bonnie Gunn. She's the assistant professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Global Animal Health at Washington State University. Dr. Gunn, thanks for joining us today. I understand that you had some formative childhood experiences that really set you on the path to where you are today.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And so I'm originally from Australia, and when I was about 1 year old, my parents actually took me to Papua New Guinea. And so my father is an anthropologist, and he has spent a lot of time and does a lot of field work there trying to understand and talk to the people about their traditions and their culture there. So he brought me and my mother there, and then I actually learned to walk on the islands in Papua New Guinea. And so in some of the So in some of the villages, most of the people there actually live more live off the land, and so they spend a lot of time outdoors. And so this is a picture of me and my mother actually on the islands there. And so because most of the people spend so much time outdoors, they are really susceptible, and there's a lot of opportunity for them to be infected and bitten by mosquitoes. And so mosquitoes do carry a parasite called malaria, which can be especially bad for adults, but is incredibly bad for children. And so while I was there, I actually got infected by malaria. And while I was then flown back to Australia for treatment, most children in Papua New Guinea do not have that opportunity. And so it's really long been my goal to sort of help understand pathogenesis and understand malaria and how other diseases, and basically understand how other pathogens.
Well, it is such an interesting story, and we're actually going to be talking more about Papua New Guinea next week, so thanks for telling us about that. I wanted to start with you by asking if you can explain to us, what's a zoonotic disease?
Yeah, a zoonotic disease is an infection that is originally in animals that is then transmitted to humans. And so this can be caused through either a virus, a bacteria, or a parasite. And then ultimately, sort of the power of these different pathogens is that they can infect both human and animal cells. And so once they can actually get into a human host, many times they can start to replicate and spread human to human. And this is where we start seeing outbreaks of human disease. So there are many different zoonotic pathogens that cause some very common diseases. So these include things like foodborne illnesses such as salmonella, which can obviously be transmitted to humans by the consumption of raw meat. And then other diseases such as rabies, which can be transmitted from infected dogs and raccoons to people. So some of the most devastating outbreaks of infectious disease in the history of the world have really been caused by zoonotic diseases. So in particular, the bubonic plague comes to mind, which decimated about half the population of Europe in the Middle Ages. More recently, we have seen increasing numbers of outbreaks of zoonotic disease in in areas around the world. So we've had SARS, swine flu, MERS, and Ebola, and of course now we have SARS-CoV-2. And while these viruses can come from a variety of different animal sources, so bats, pigs, and camels, many different pathogens are present in different animal populations, and so these new pathogens can emerge at any time.
Well, thank you. And I think that's actually a really great segue. I'd like to ask you to sort of walk us through why is it important for us to be thinking about animal health as part of global health as we're looking at this pandemic? And you sort of talked about some past pandemics as well.
Yeah, and so for me, it's actually twofold. So the first reason that I really think it's important for us to consider animal health and human health is, the fact that animals and humans are really connected together, and there's a lot of opportunity for the transmission of different diseases between both animals and humans. So they're caused through many different mechanisms, and some scenarios are very common, such as the handling of livestock in agriculture, having pets, or the presence of rats and mice in urban areas or in outdoor storage sheds. So more recently, there's been the expansion of humans into areas that we really haven't inhabited before. And so this is actually increasing the frequency of interactions between infected animals and humans. And now, of course, with we've seen, especially with COVID, how rapidly these diseases can spread between animals and humans, and then spread rapidly around the world due to both the relative ease and affordability of global travel. So for me, watching and understanding how monitoring different diseases in animal populations can really help us understand and kind of predict what is happening in the future. So the second reason I think this is actually really important is the fact that animal health can also be directly tied to human socioeconomic development. And so this is particularly important for many people in the developing world, where their livelihood really depend on the health of their livestock. So if a disease impacts and comes out into a herd of animals, it can be incredibly devastating for not only the animals but for the people themselves, and then really forces these individuals to make sort of hard decisions, about how to actually then spend their time and resources. So some of my colleagues at the Allen School have really been studying this interaction and this relationship between animal and human health. And what they have found is that programs that vaccinate cattle, for example, in East Africa, have then increased the reliability and the profitability of family farms, which then in turn allow the creation of time and resources that enable, let's say, girls to then be able to pursue their education. So the sort of intersection between both animal health and global health sort of comes both at the level of disease as well as socioeconomic development.
Well, and the global health discussion is obviously a really heavy one right now, but it also sounds like there's some good news in that you and your team are looking to offer some solutions to these challenges. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so at the Paul Allen School of Global Animal Health at Washington State University, we're really focused on trying to take sort of a holistic approach to approaching the global infectious disease issues. So we really try and pursue this through research, training, outreach programs, and the implementation of different disease control and surveillance strategies. So again, one example of this was in the context of rabies, where our researchers had found that a lot of wild animals were also dying from rabies infection, most likely contracting it from domesticated dogs. So a vaccination program to vaccinate dogs ultimately resulted in a reduction in the mortality not only of humans from rabies, but also of these wild animals. So in terms of the current outbreak, we're increasing our programs to look at disease in animals and disease surveillance in animals, in animal populations. And my particular research really focuses on immunity and understanding immunity to these different zoonotic pathogens in the context of both humans and animal hosts. So we found antibodies, particular kinds of antibodies that can provide protection from some really seriously deadly diseases like Ebola. And we are now trying to see whether or not we can grow up these antibodies and in the laboratory and use them as therapeutics and see whether or not there may actually be additional types, or if these antibodies can also be effective in the treatment of other diseases as well. So ultimately, we believe that animals and humans are all connected. And so we really try and work with the local communities to try and engage them, to train them and teach them to implement their own disease control strategies, so that ultimately will lead us to both healthier animals, healthy people, a healthy planet.
That is so cool. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Dr. Gunn, for being with us today. And thanks for sharing that and the work that you're doing. If all of you would like to learn more about Dr. Gunn's work at Washington State University, we're posting some resource links in the live chat. Bonnie, thank you again for being here with us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, when we started today's discussion, I asked all of you a question for the live poll. And after everything our panelists have shared with you and our guest, I'd like to revisit that question and ask you again. So please activate your chat function, and let's see if your perception has changed at all. So here's the question. Do you see your personal health connected to the health of wildlife? Type 1 for, I still don't see it. Type 2 for, I can see some connection. Type 3 for, I can see a lot of connection. Or type 4 for, we're critically tied to one another. And while you're typing your answer, I'd like to come back to our panel for a very quick final question, 1 or 2 sentences each. And I'd like to ask all of you, for folks that are watching that really care about animals and they'd like some advice about something that they can do in their home or their community, what can they do to help? We'll start with Dr. Hawks.
Well, we're all spending a lot more time at home lately, and there's lots of things you can do at home in your backyard, in your neighborhood park. You know, plant pollinator plants, don't use pesticides, herbicides, put out water for animals. If you're using bird feeders, make sure you clean them. And please keep your cats indoors. Millions of songbirds are lost each year because of our pet cats. So please keep them indoors, or even better yet, build them a cat patio so they can be outside safely.
Thanks, Nancy. Dr. Storms?
With regard to the COVID virus, there's a lot of concerns and questions. Cats in particular are susceptible to the virus more than dogs. You don't have to worry about either of those two animals yourself as far as getting the virus from them. There has been no indication of that. But tying on to what Nancy just said, another good reason to keep your cats inside, to make sure that they're not exposed unduly to someone who is infected, because they are susceptible. And still try to do what you can for your pets. Emergency preparedness, make sure you have a kit available for taking care of them, enough food for a couple of weeks in case you are homebound, have to be quarantined. But by and large, don't panic and provide them what they need.
Thanks, Tim. Dr. Baird?
Well, if you really enjoyed all the things we talked about today, really visiting your local accredited zoo and aquarium helps support all of those things that we talked about. So I know Woodland Park Zoo has a relief fund, and zoos all over the country have their own relief funds. So if you can just come visit, that helps a lot, or even engage with us online, see some virtual programming, or if you have the means, go ahead and donate. But anything that you do interacting with your local zoo or aquarium helps us with all the amazing work that we've heard about today.
Thank you. Well, let's check out the results of that live poll. Wow, it seems like we've had a pretty significant jump. The last time we asked you if you saw your health connected to the health of wildlife, we had 57% of folks say that they thought we were critically connected to one another, and now it's 97%. And so I credit our panel with that and all of our special guests, and I'm so glad that we were able to help share this news with you. I hope you've enjoyed this hour as we've explored One Care, animals and human care, and the role of zoos. I'd like to thank our in-studio panelists, Rachel Salant, Dr. Bonnie Baird, Dr. Nancy Hawks, Dr. Tim Storms, and our live video guests, Dr. Bonnie Gunn, Dr. Tara Harris, and Dr. Tara Stawinski. And finally, thanks to our pre-recorded guests, Mr. Grant Abel, Dr. Marc Ancrenaz, Mr. Dan Ashe, and Ms. Wai-Yi Lam. This episode has been recorded, and it'll be available at zoo.org/onewildworld if you'd like to rewatch it or go back and find the social media handles for any of our guests or any of the live chat resources that we posted this hour. As a special thanks, we're also posting a link to Woodland Park Zoo's My Zoo magazine, which is normally reserved just for our guests and members, and it came out yesterday. Our website also has Common Core discussion prompts available now for middle and high school students and teachers who want to do a deep dive into today's discussion. I hope you'll join us next week as we build on today's topics and explore this pandemic, wildlife, and the health of our region in One Northwest, the species and spaces of the Pacific Northwest. There's an incredible lineup of experts, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks again to U.S. Fish and Wildlife for the grant support of this event, and to our partners at Seattle Lives and PNTA for bringing us to you live. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you next week for One Wild World.
Thank you.